January 13th, 2006, 7 o'clock in the evening. Buenos Aires police have surrounded a bank in the quiet suburb of Acasuso for nearly 7 hours. Helicopters circle overhead. SWAT teams are positioned on rooftops. Every news camera in Argentina is pointed at this building, broadcasting live to millions. Inside, hostages wait. Outside, negotiators talk. Everyone knows how this ends. The criminals trapped inside will eventually surrender or die trying. Except there's one problem. The criminals aren't inside anymore. They haven't been for 2 hours. Right now, 6 men are sitting in a safe house several miles away, eating pizza, counting roughly $20 million in cash, and watching themselves on television as the police prepare to storm an empty bank. They've just pulled off one of the most audacious robberies in history, and the cops don't have a clue. This is the story of how an artist, a karate instructor, an engineer, and a theater enthusiast decided to rob a bank using toy guns, a tunnel through the sewers, and a plan inspired by Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's a story about the greatest heist Argentina has ever seen. But to understand why it happened, we need to understand what Argentina had become. Let's rewind 5 years. December 2001. Argentina, once one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, is collapsing. The government has just announced the Corralito, freezing all bank accounts. Overnight, people can't access their own money. Not to buy food, not to pay rent, nothing. The peso, which had been fixed to the dollar for a decade, crashes. Life savings evaporate. Middle-class families who worked their entire lives watch their wealth disappear while they sleep. People riot in the streets. They bang pots and pans outside government buildings. 5 presidents resign in 2 weeks. Protesters storm banks, smashing windows, spray-painting messages of betrayal on walls. The trust is gone. The social contract is shattered. And in the middle of all this chaos, one thing remains untouched: safety deposit boxes. While regular accounts were frozen and devalued, whatever you had locked in those little metal boxes stayed yours. Cash, jewelry, bonds, documents. If you were wealthy enough to afford a safety deposit box before the crisis, you were one of the few people in Argentina who didn't lose everything. By 2003, the worst is over, but the anger remains. People still remember. They remember the politicians who lied. They remember the bankers who walked away unpunished. They remember how the system failed them while the rich stayed rich. And in this environment of simmering resentment and economic desperation, a 36-year-old artist named Fernando Araujo starts to imagine something beautiful. He's going to rob a bank. Not just any bank. He's going to rob it in a way that makes fools of everyone who represents that broken system. He's going to create a masterpiece. Fernando Araujo was not your typical criminal. He was a visual artist, a painter and sculptor, living in Acasuso, the same quiet suburb where our story begins. He taught karate and Brazilian jiu-jitsu at a local dojo. He also grew marijuana in his apartment, not for profit particularly, but because he believed in 3 forms of art: plastic arts, martial arts, and the art of growing cannabis. Fernando was what you might call eccentric. He smoked weed, watched heist movies obsessively, and thought deeply about the nature of performance and spectacle. Somewhere in late 2004, while watching yet another crime film, an idea formed. What if he could plan the perfect robbery? Not just to get rich, though money would be nice, but to create something so clever, so audacious, that it would humiliate the institutions that had humiliated Argentina. He started small. Surveillance. He lived in Acasuso, a wealthy neighborhood north of Buenos Aires, and he needed a target close to home. He found it at the corner of Avenida del Libertador and Calle Peru. Banco Rio, a branch of one of Argentina's largest banks, sitting in one of the richest neighborhoods in the country. Perfect symbolic value. He began watching the bank, noting shift changes, security routines, customer patterns. He sketched the building, he counted the cameras, he imagined entry points, and then he hit a wall. There was no way to do this. The security was too tight. The police response would be too fast. Every traditional approach he considered fell apart under scrutiny. He nearly gave up. Then he found the drain. 10 blocks from the bank, there was an access point to the city's storm drain system. Buenos Aires, like many old cities, has an extensive underground network of sewers and drainage tunnels built over a century ago. Some are massive. Some are forgotten. Araujo measured the distance from that drain to the bank. He calculated angles. He realized something that changed everything. If you could dig through the drainage system, you could reach the bank's vault from below. You could avoid all the security, all the cameras, all the alarms. You could be in and out before anyone knew you were there. But this wasn't a job for one person. This wasn't even a job for two. Fernando needed help. He needed someone who understood engineering, who could build things, who had the technical skills to make this insane plan work. He reached out to an old acquaintance from high school, Sebastian Garcia Bolster. They weren't friends exactly, but Fernando knew Bolster's reputation. The guy was brilliant with tools, with mechanics, with construction. Bolster had worked in engineering and knew his way around complex problems. When Fernando laid out the plan, Bolster didn't laugh. He didn't say it was impossible. He said, "Let me think about it." After weeks of consideration, Bolster was in. The two of them spent months in the sewers, measuring, planning, calculating load-bearing requirements and ventilation needs. They realized they could actually do this, but they needed more people, more labor, more expertise, and more importantly, they needed funding for equipment. Fernando reached out to a contact known only as El Doc. El Doc was a professional criminal, someone with connections to organized crime in Argentina. He had money, he had experience, he had access to people who knew how to move in the underworld. El Doc brought in more crew. Ruben Alberto de la Torre, another experienced criminal. Luis Mario Vitet Solanas, a Uruguayan who had spent time in the notorious Punta Carretas prison and had actually studied theater because he believed criminals needed to know how to perform. Vitet would become their negotiator, the voice that would keep police distracted during the robbery. Finally, they recruited Julian Zalo Echeverria, who would drive the getaway vehicle, and another Uruguayan associate of Vitet, known only as El Nene. Fernando called the operation Project Donatello, after the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. Think about it. Donatello was the intelligent one, the engineer. The turtles were green, like marijuana. They lived underground in the sewers. They were masters of martial arts. It was perfect. The team was assembled. Now came the hard part. They had to build the tunnel. For nearly a year, from 2005 into early 2006, this crew worked underground, literally. They entered the storm drain system through that access point 10 blocks from the bank and began digging, not with shovels. They brought in pneumatic equipment, industrial tools, lighting rigs. Bolster engineered a system to remove soil and reinforce the tunnel walls with wood supports. They installed ventilation so they wouldn't suffocate. They ran electrical lines for lights. This wasn't some amateur operation. This was construction. They were building a 220-meter tunnel through Buenos Aires underground, and nobody noticed. Think about the logistics. Every time they went down there, they risked being seen. Every bucket of dirt they removed had to be disposed of secretly. They couldn't just dump it on the street. They worked at night mostly, but even then, they had to be careful. Neighbors complained about strange noises, construction sounds at odd hours, but nobody investigated. Nobody thought criminals might be tunneling toward a bank vault. Because that's movie stuff. That doesn't happen in real life. While they dug, they prepared the rest of the operation. They bought toy guns, realistic-looking replicas that could fool people in the moment but wouldn't show up in an investigation as real weapons. This was crucial. Fernando wanted no violence, no injuries. This was supposed to be art, not murder. They fabricated a custom hydraulic tool they called Cañón Power. It was designed specifically to break open safety deposit boxes quickly and efficiently. They tested it. It worked beautifully. They purchased inflatable boats and small motors. The plan was to load the money into these boats and motor through the drainage system to an exit point 14 blocks away on Calle Peru. There, a modified Volkswagen Combi van would be waiting. They cut a hole in the floor of the van so they could load bags directly from the manhole without being seen on the street. They rehearsed the entire sequence multiple times. They studied police response protocols. They monitored radio frequencies used by the Buenos Aires police. Fernando bought a police scanner so they could listen to law enforcement communications during the robbery. Vitet, the Uruguayan theater enthusiast, took acting classes. Not as a hobby, as preparation. He would be the voice of the robbery, the negotiator who would speak to police. He needed to sound calm, rational, sympathetic. He needed to keep them talking, keep them engaged, keep them distracted while the real work happened downstairs. Several times during the year of preparation, they almost quit. The tunnel flooded during heavy rains. They had to pump it out and reinforce sections. Equipment broke. Money ran tight, but they kept going, because by this point, they were too invested to stop. And because Fernando believed they could actually do it. By January 2006, everything was ready. They picked a date, Friday the 13th, because why not? If you're going to rob a bank, you might as well embrace the symbolism. On the morning of January 13th, 2006, 6 men woke up knowing that by the end of the day, they would either be millionaires or prisoners. There was no in-between. The operation began at 12:38 p.m. 2 men walked into the Banco Rio branch in Acasuso through the front door. One wore a gray suit. The other had on a work smock and a wig. They were Alberto de la Torre and El Doc. They looked like a businessman and a maintenance worker. Nobody paid attention. At the same moment, 2 more men entered through a different entrance. Luis Vitet and El Nene arrived via the parking garage, driving a Ford Escort. They parked underground, walked calmly into the bank, and within seconds, the 4 men pulled out their weapons. Everyone freeze. This is a robbery. Nobody move and nobody gets hurt. 23 people were in the bank, employees and customers. They were herded together, told to lie on the floor, stay calm. The guns looked real. They weren't, but nobody knew that. The bank's security guard, watching on monitors, immediately called the federal police. Within minutes, the call went out. Bank robbery in progress. Hostages taken. Armed suspects. Every available unit, respond. At 12:50, the media picked up the story. Crónica TV, one of Argentina's most sensational news networks, was first on the scene. Within an hour, every channel in the country was broadcasting live. Helicopters arrived. SWAT teams took positions. Negotiators set up communications. The entire apparatus of law enforcement mobilized around this bank. Meanwhile, Sebastián Bolster was already underground, entering the tunnel from the drainage access point. At approximately the same time the robbery started upstairs, Bolster broke through the final barrier into the bank's basement. He was in. Julián Zalo Echeverría was positioned 14 blocks away at the exit point, waiting with the Volkswagen Combi van. Everything was in motion. Upstairs, Fernando Araujo entered last. He wore a loose jacket and a cap, looking nervous. Which he was, a little. This was the moment. Years of planning, months of digging, and now it was happening. He took his position with the hostages, playing his role, the scared but compliant criminal. Meanwhile, downstairs, Bolster began setting up the cañón power and preparing to break into the vault. The first hostage was released at 2 p.m. Walter Serrano, a security guard who had been stationed in the basement and was resisting leaving his post. The robbers pushed him out the front door, hands up, unharmed. This was part of the strategy. Release hostages periodically to show good faith and keep the negotiators hopeful. At this point, the police still believed they were dealing with a standard hostage situation, desperate criminals who would eventually surrender. Miguel Sileo, the lead negotiator for the federal police, made the first call. He asked the criminals to release more hostages. He offered food and water. He tried to build rapport. The voice on the other end was calm, reasonable. It was Luis Vitet playing the role of his life. Vitet called himself Walter on the phone. He told Sileo that they didn't want to hurt anyone, but they needed time to think. He said they were scared. They needed to figure out how to get out of this safely. Sileo believed him. This conversation bought them precious minutes. At 3:20 p.m., Vitet released a second hostage, a bank employee who came out looking shaken but unharmed. Then a pregnant customer. The robbers made a show of being compassionate. Look, we're not monsters. We're just in a bad situation. Meanwhile, Fernando was listening to police radio communications on his scanner. He heard tactical units discussing positions. He heard someone mention snipers on nearby rooftops. He relayed this information quietly to the others. They adjusted. They stayed away from windows. They kept hostages between themselves and potential lines of fire. Downstairs, Bolster was working. The vault door had been opened during business hours, which made things easier. He didn't have to crack the main vault. He just had to get past the safety deposit boxes themselves. The cañón power worked exactly as designed, a hydraulic blade that wedged into the seam of each box and pried it open in seconds. He moved systematically, box after box, cash, jewelry, bonds, documents, handfuls of American dollars, Argentine pesos, euros, gold chains, diamond rings, stock certificates. He shoved everything into large duffel bags. In the background, he could hear the muffled sounds of activity upstairs, hostages crying, Vitet's voice on the phone with police, his own breathing echoing in the confined space. By 4:30 p.m., Vitet made another call to Celio. He said they were hungry, they hadn't eaten all day, and they were getting tired. If the police could send in some food and drinks, maybe they could start talking seriously about how to end this peacefully. Celio agreed immediately. Food arrived, pizza and Coca-Cola. The robbers shared it with the hostages. At one point, they learned it was one of the hostages' birthdays. They sang happy birthday. This wasn't cruelty. It wasn't mockery. This was Fernando's vision. Make it absurd. Make it memorable. This wasn't a violent crime. This was theater. The food delivery gave Bolster an extra hour. By this point, he had opened 143 safety deposit boxes. The bags were full. Heavy. Too heavy to carry through a narrow tunnel. That's where the boats came in. At around 5 p.m., the team upstairs started preparing to leave. Quietly, in small groups, they moved toward the basement access point. The hostages didn't even notice at first, and when they did, they were instructed to stay silent. Don't make a sound for at least 10 minutes, or we come back. The hostages, terrified, complied. One by one, the robbers slipped through the hole Bolster had cut into the vault floor and disappeared into the tunnel. They carried the bags down into the drainage system, loaded them onto the inflatable boats, and started the motors Bolster had rigged. The tunnel was lit by the electrical lines they'd installed. It was cramped, cold, and smelled terrible, but it worked. They motored through the underground waterway, 2 boats carrying millions of dollars in stolen goods, heading toward the exit point 14 blocks away. Behind them, they left a false bomb. A bundle of wires and electronic components that looked dangerous, but was completely inert. This was designed to slow down police even more once they discovered the tunnel. They wanted every possible second of head start. At approximately 6:50 p.m., one of the hostages inside the bank called his sister, who was waiting outside with the crowd. He whispered that it had been quiet for a while, too quiet. He thought maybe the robbers had left. She told the police. The SWAT teams prepared to breach. At 7 p.m., the Halcon Special Operations Unit stormed the bank. They moved fast, clearing rooms with military precision. They found the hostages, confused and shaken but alive. They found the toy guns. They found the pizza boxes. And then they went downstairs and found the note, written on a piece of cardboard left on the floor of the vault. It read, En barrio de ricachones, sin armas ni rencores, es solo plata y no amores. In a rich man's neighborhood, without weapons or grudges, it's only money and not love. The police descended into the basement. They found the hole in the vault floor. They followed it down into the tunnel, and then they found the bomb. The entire team evacuated. Nobody wanted to touch it. They called in the bomb squad. Specialists arrived. Robots were deployed. They examined the device for 2 hours before determining it was fake. By then, it was after 9 p.m. The robbers had been gone for more than 3 hours. According to Fernando Araujo, in the documentary that would later be made about the heist, when they arrived at their predetermined safe house to divide the money, they turned on the television, and they watched, in real time, as the Halcon unit stormed the empty bank. They watched the news anchors speculate about the hostages. They watched the police discover the tunnel. They watched all of it while sitting on a couch, eating pizza, and counting roughly $20 million in cash. They had done it. They had pulled off the robbery. And now came the hardest part, disappearing. The plan was simple. Divide the money. Each person takes their share. Everyone goes their separate ways. No contact, ever. Disappear into Argentina and never speak of this again. If everyone kept quiet, if everyone resisted the urge to spend conspicuously, they could get away with it. They split the money 6 ways. Each man walked out of that safe house with approximately $3 to $4 million. Some reports suggest it was closer to 20 million total. Some say 8 to 15 million. The exact amount has never been confirmed because most of the money was never recovered. What is certain is that each member of the crew became wealthy overnight. For about a month, it worked. The police had no leads. The media speculated wildly. Some people called it the heist of the century. Others said it was a failure because the criminals would inevitably be caught. Experts debated whether the tunnel was an engineering marvel or a desperate gamble, and the robbers stayed silent. But in February, 1 month after the robbery, everything fell apart. Alberto de la Torre, the man in the work smock, had a wife named Alicia Di Tullio, and Alicia was furious. She had discovered that a large sum of money was missing, specifically $300,000. Beto had hidden his share of the heist money, but Alicia had found it. And being married to a criminal, she figured she deserved some of it, so she took it. When Beto found out, he confronted her. They fought. It escalated. And Alicia, in a fit of rage and revenge, made a decision that would destroy everything. She went to the police. She told them her husband had participated in the Banco Rio robbery. She gave them names. She gave them locations. She gave them everything they needed to start making arrests. On February 10, 2006, less than a month after the heist, Alberto de la Torre was arrested. Police found $700,000 in cash in a bag at his home. He was the first to fall. Within weeks, Sebastián Bolster was arrested in Villa Gesell, a beach town south of Buenos Aires. He confessed immediately, not because he was weak, but because he knew it was over. The police had his name. They had evidence. Fighting would only make things worse. Interestingly, despite searching his properties thoroughly, the police never found any of his share of the money. He had hidden it well. Luis Vitet, the negotiator, was in Uruguay when he heard about the arrests. He received a call from El Doc, who told him that Di Tullio was demanding $300,000 to keep quiet. But it was too late. She'd already talked. Vitet made a calculated decision. He cut a deal with Argentine authorities. He surrendered himself in Buenos Aires and negotiated a reduced sentence through an abbreviated trial process. He was initially sentenced to 21 years and 6 months, though this would later be reduced. Fernando Araujo was in the mountains of San Juan province when his lawyer sent him the case file, more than 8 volumes of evidence. He knew he was finished. The stress caused him to lose weight rapidly. He tried to hide, camping in remote areas, hoping to wait out the initial manhunt. But on April 11, 2006, the Gendarmeria, Argentina's border patrol force, found him. They asked what he was doing in such a remote location. Fernando said he was on a spiritual retreat. They started to search his tent, and Fernando, exhausted and knowing it was pointless to keep running, interrupted them. He said, "Don't waste your time. I'm Fernando Araujo." 2 members of the crew were never caught. El Doc and El Nene, the 2 associates who helped with the muscle and logistics, disappeared. There are rumors El Doc became a lawyer while in prison on unrelated charges. Others say he left the country. El Nene is believed to have returned to Uruguay and vanished into obscurity. They kept their shares of the money and were never identified by police. The trial for the captured robbers began on February 15, 2010, 4 years after the heist. Alberto de la Torre, Fernando Araujo, Sebastián Bolster, and Julián Zaloecheverria stood before a judge. The prosecution initially sought sentences of more than 20 years for all of them. But there was a problem. The police never found any real weapons. Every gun recovered was a toy. Plastic replicas. The prosecution tried to argue that witnesses had seen real guns, specifically a Browning shotgun. But without physical evidence, it was hard to prove. In the end, the sentences were lighter than expected. Alberto de la Torre received 15 years. Fernando Araujo got 14. Zaloecheverria received 10. Sebastián Bolster was sentenced to just 9 years. All of these sentences were later reduced on appeal. By mid-2014, every single one of them was free. They had served, on average, about 4 to 8 years each. And the money, the vast majority of it, was never recovered. To this day, millions of dollars from the Banco Rio heist remain hidden somewhere in Argentina. The crew never talked. They never gave up the locations of their stashes. And when they got out of prison, they walked back into lives that were, by all accounts, reasonably comfortable. The heist became a cultural phenomenon in Argentina. In 2020, a film called El Robo del Siglo was released, dramatizing the events. It became one of the highest-grossing Argentine films of the year. In 2022, a Netflix documentary called Los Ladrones gave the actual robbers a platform to tell their own story. They've done interviews, they've appeared on talk shows. Fernando Araujo now teaches karate and works as a screenwriter. He's written about his experiences, framing the heist as a form of artistic expression. The public response has been complicated, but largely sympathetic. In a country where banks are seen as villains, where the financial system crushed ordinary people, these robbers didn't hurt anyone. They used fake guns. They sang happy birthday to a hostage. They left a cheeky note mocking the rich. And they embarrassed the police on live television. There's even been a recent attempt to replicate the heist. In August 2024, police in San Isidro, another wealthy suburb near Buenos Aires, discovered a 150-meter tunnel leading toward a Banco Macro branch. It was nearly complete. Mattresses were found inside, suggesting the criminals had been living underground for months during construction. The tunnel was described by investigators as even more sophisticated than the 2006 Banco Rio tunnel. Better engineering than El Chapo's prison escape tunnel, one officer said. The criminals were never caught. They apparently abandoned the operation, possibly spooked by increased security or media attention. The discovery reignited fascination with the original heist and raised uncomfortable questions about whether Argentina's banking security had improved at all in 18 years. The Banco Rio heist endures because it represents something more than crime. It was revenge against a system that failed its people. In the aftermath of the 2001 economic collapse, Argentines felt betrayed by their government, their banks, and their institutions. Trust was gone. The social contract was broken. And into that void came Fernando Araujo and his crew, not with guns and violence, but with art and audacity. They robbed the bank that symbolized that betrayal, and they did it without firing a shot. They made fools of the police and walked away with millions. And for a lot of people in Argentina, that felt like justice. Is it right to celebrate criminals? Probably not. The people whose safety deposit boxes were emptied lost valuables, sentimental items, cash they had saved for emergencies. Those victims didn't deserve what happened to them. But in the court of public opinion, the crew of the Banco Rio heist were never seen as common thieves. They were seen as modern-day Robin Hoods, or perhaps more accurately, as performance artists whose medium was crime. Fernando Araujo called it Project Donatello, a reference to a cartoon turtle who lived in the sewers and used intelligence instead of brute force. And in a strange way, that's exactly what it was, a carefully constructed work of creativity and rebellion executed under the city, out of sight until the moment it exploded into public view. Today, the members of the crew live quietly. Most of them keep low profiles. They've done their time, they've told their stories, and they still have their money. The cops never found it. Not most of it anyway. Somewhere in Argentina, buried or hidden or stashed in places only 6 men know, there are millions of dollars waiting. And every time someone in Buenos Aires complains about banks or politicians or the system that continues to fail ordinary people, someone inevitably brings up the story of the Banco Rio heist. The day 6 men decided they'd had enough and took back what they felt the banks had stolen from everyone else. They didn't succeed perfectly. They got caught. They went to prison. But they also became legends. And in Argentina, where trust in institutions remains fragile and anger at past injustices still simmers, that might be the greatest heist of all. Not the money they stole, but the story they created. A story that refuses to die.